Okay, well, welcome everybody. This is week 4 of FDLS130. Really excited to be here. We're making pretty steady progress throughout the course. I've been really grateful for everybody continuing to kind of keep up on the work and making sure you're making that progress. So now is a good time for us to kind of stop for a minute, pause, see how we're doing in the course, think about what we're doing that's working really well, think about what we're doing that might need a little bit of adjustment. And a lot of this is important at this point in the process because I think what happens sometimes is for us, we start really strong and enthusiastic about a course. And for many of you, this is your first semester or session, even course at Mercer. So we can often kind of do the January thing for the first month, where if we had uh, um, a New Year's resolution in January, we would start really strong. And then by the end of January, if we had a goal to go to the gym 3 times a week, we might go 2 times a week and then 2 times and then down to 1. And then pretty soon by February, we could be so distant from our goals that we're not making that progress anymore. That's not typically the case for what I'm seeing in FDLS right now. I'm seeing more people doing a great job of staying on top of their stuff. And that's sort of why even more important that we check in on everybody, make sure we're doing well, because now is the time to make sure that we keep finishing strong. So the sports analogy that I'm going to rely on here is if we think about this a little bit like halftime for a football game, if we're doing really well, now is not the time to take it easy, because we've all seen that happen in the second half with our teams where things are going well, they go in at half and then everything kind of the wheels fall off. But the same is also true that if you have a really great team, then they come out of half and they sort of commit themselves to the craft of what they're doing and kind of making that forward progress. So now is a great time to think of yourself really as that strong team that's ready to go and finish up the semester really well. And I'd love to see as many people as possible make it through as successfully as possible going from here. So just take a few minutes wherever you are, think about what your goals are, maybe write down, do a quick journal to yourself, think about your why. So many of you week 1 talked quite a bit about why you're here at Mercer. And what was fascinating to me is very few people listed that they were here for their own personal sort of goals. Most people would list family members or parents or people that they wanted to make sure that they were doing their best to show up as their best version of themselves. Revisit that, because that can be really helpful, especially if you're in a situation like many of us are, where you make big sacrifices to be here, and the people who you committed to Mercer to finish your degree because of people, but often the irony is that means you have to take time away from those people. And so now is a great time to just really understand and look at your progress, know that the effort you're putting in is worth it, and the sacrifices you make, taking that time away from those people to be able to commit to your own success, is worth it as well. That's my TED Talk for now. Let's get right down to brass tacks here, and we're going to talk about what we've got this week. I want us to just start with a reminder of our objectives for the week. This you can find verbatim on the Canvas page under objectives, so the start of the module. We're going to be talking today about the thesis statement and sort of some of the characteristics or dynamics of a thesis statement. Then we're going to apply our understanding of thesis statements to create our own draft of a thesis statement. That's this week, basically, is one of the things that you're working on. And we're going to learn the basic conventions of APA formatting and why we use that format at all. So I want us to understand I want us to move beyond the idea that APA or MLA or Chicago, whatever format your professor requires you to use, I want you to know that it's not just sort of a hazing. It's actually very important that we understand why these conventions are in place, why they've changed, and then also why the methods that we're talking about to make sure our papers stay within the parameters of those conventions. I want us to understand why that's important, because it seems like such a little thing often, and it seems like such a headache to many people. And there's so many services out there that promise to do it for you that always mess it up for you, that I want us to understand why it's important to kind of commit to this one detail and think through why that detail is so important to the process. So for today's agenda here in the asynchronous meeting, we're going to talk a little bit about housekeeping. This is just kind of where we started with the idea that we're in week 4, but I want us to talk over some housekeeping details. I want us to also talk about thesis statements and the relationship to the paper, the audience, and the primary source. So I want us to think a little bit about this thesis. We're going to talk a lot about the thesis today. And then I want us to think about the thesis and understand how it impacts what we do and do not include in our paper, because so often we will be in a position where we will think to ourselves, our goal is just to kind of put everything that's even remotely related to the topic in the paper. And that doesn't always serve us as well as we would think. It can actually make things a lot more difficult for us to articulate our really brilliant thoughts. And it can obscure the fact that we need to really develop our argument and think through what argument actually means, because it's very different in the academic setting than what you would think elsewhere. Kind of the long and short of it is, when I say argument in this context, it doesn't mean an argument like you might have with your partner, with your children, with your parents. That's a fight often, meaning that in those discussions, well, maybe not, I don't know. But when you have a fight, you want to win, whereas in academic argument, everybody's on the same team. So I guess maybe a little bit like when you're having arguments with your family, that could be similar too, where everybody wants to figure out the best route forward. I want us to think about our ways to complicate our thesis, and that's an important term here because so much of what we get, even in Evergreen, I'm not super happy with by way of the way we understand our argument and our goal in the paper. And what I mean by that is, often we're told here, this is the third bullet point, by the way, fourth bullet point. Often what we've been told is that our paper is to prove our thesis, and that's our whole goal. And that is often kind of true, that our goal in a paper is to prove our thesis, but it's so much more than that. And there's so many ways that if we understand that our job is to complicate our thesis rather than just prove it, that we will make much better papers throughout our time here at Mercer. And more than that, we'll be able to start interpreting other arguments on a deeper level. So think a little bit like a great thesis is like Shrek's onion with lots of layers. And so we want to know how to create those layers, where it's not just to prove the onion exists. Often our paper is to start peeling back layers and seeing the way that our thesis has complications that ripple and have impacts elsewhere. So we want to think about those in some different ways. And then finally, this is sort of, I'm going to put this here, I'm going to list it as tentative. And what that means is that's if we have time to get to it. We're going to talk about APA and conventions. And that one, if we can't talk about it right now, we have plenty of time to get to it throughout the course of the semester and even your time here at Mercer. But I don't want to promise that we'll cover something that we might not have time to. So let's talk a little bit about housekeeping here. I think now is a good time to kind of shift over and take a peek here at the Canvas page. And I just want to remind everybody of a couple of different things that sort of popped up this week. First things first is when you're going through the modules, just make sure that you're reading all the directions really carefully. Specifically, for example, it's really useful for us as we look over the quiz questions. It's really important for us to notice the, say for instance, if there's a requirement for a sentence count. This seems like a small detail, but the goal of these types of questions is not just to kind of give you busy work. That's not my goal at all. But the goal is really to put you in a position where you are then practicing looking for that depth that we talked about, and where if I require you to write 4 sentences, then you'll have to push past the basic understanding of the topic and think through those next steps. So my recommendation for you as you do each of the assignments, maybe take a little scrap of paper, doesn't matter, but each time you get an assignment, make a little to-do list of a checklist of things you know that assignment's asking for. So for example, when you get to this quiz, I probably shouldn't have changed pages there, right? But when you get to this quiz, what you might do is read over this question and then make a checklist where you say, I'm going to write 4 to 5 or 5 to 6 sentences. So that's a little checkbox that you have. And then here you're going to choose one of the topics, and then you're going to read it, and then you're going to respond to it. Those kind of making that list, the to-do list, can be really useful to make sure you get full credit for your hard work. What I see happening sometimes, not always, is that we'll have someone do a great job with this, but maybe they'll write 2 sentences instead. And so what that tells me is that you absolutely know you're capable, but you're struggling to remember those details about the question itself, or maybe you're moving off topic or doing something that's asking, maybe you're moving in a different direction. So a checklist can really help you before you click submit to make sure that you are doing the work that you want credit for as well as possible. That was an awkward sentence. That you're doing the best possible work you can and earning full credit for it as such. So take a close look at those different assignments. And again, before you submit anything, be sure you make that little checklist and kind of make some notes to yourself. That holds true here with the discussion and responses as well. This is really helpful. That skill of making a list of what you want to accomplish is really great for this. We're going to come back to the discussion board here shortly when we start talking about thesis statements, because some of the ways that that discussion board has been built is specifically designed to help you start building those thesis statements and thinking through the idea of argument. So we'll revisit that one shortly. Let's go back over to the our Word document for today. So with that, also, one of the things I want to mention is make sure that you go through the syllabus and you sort of add to your calendar the days different assignments are due. That's really important because a couple of times there have been people who get confused because the assignments are due on one day and then the module stays open for 7 days past that. Now, the available date is not the same. What that is basically, if you remember from the late policy, you can turn in your work on the day it's due or before, and then after that, for 7 days, you can still submit the work, but you're losing points for that. So you have the deadline, and then you have the available date. But the available date, if you submit your work then, can only earn 30% credit. So don't confuse the two. And remember that this is week 4 that we're in. So if you signed on, say, to Canvas late that first week, you might be confused thinking that you're still in week 1 because you signed in late or something of the sort. So make sure that you know exactly which week we're on and that you're moving ahead with that and that you're not confusing the available date with the deadline. Because here's the key with this one. If you turn in work by the available date, it's often great work and it's often really strong work, but you're losing a lot of points just because it was turned in late. And that's the hard one for me as a teacher, because I don't want to take points away. I want you to get all the credit you can for your hard work. And if you're doing good work and just submitting it late, then that's particularly, I don't want to say heartbreaking, but something like that, because I know that you're doing good work and putting in that effort, and the deadline is really just the problem in that. So your grade isn't reflecting your ability, basically. Any questions about the housekeeping for the good of the order? Ariana or Rachel, any questions you'd like to ask for everybody? Okay, great. You two, of course, are doing a great job turning in your work on time. So this is me talking to everybody else. So apologies if it sounds like I'm finger wagging at anybody, and certainly not the two of you. Let's talk a little bit about this idea of a thesis statement. So a thesis statement can be a little bit tricky for folks. What do you two understand a thesis statement to be, or sort of the goal of a thesis statement?
Maybe like a summary of what you're about to write about, like, and that you put in 1 or 2 sentences at the end of your introduction paragraph.
Great. I love both things you said there, Ariana. Specifically, you said it's sort of a summary, or you can think of it in many respects as a roadmap to your argument. And then what's really interesting there too, Ariana, is you mentioned that it's at the end of your introductory paragraph. Why would you put it there?
After you introduce someone to the topic, then like you said, it's a roadmap into the body of your paragraph.
That's
That leads
correct.
you straight there.
Absolutely. Yep. And let me ask you this. This goes for everybody here, or even if you're watching this on Edpuzzle. I want you to think for a minute about the idea that about this placement, because it's really helpful for us to understand that academic writing is a convention. And what I mean by that is we build it in a certain way, not because it's what we do naturally as writers, but we build it in a certain way because it's what's expected within the context of our writing. So for example, if you're thinking about memes, right? So memes are sort of they're sort of a constructed way of operating in the world. But if you're doing a meme and you put your text over the meme, right? It's clearer for the reader who's looking at the meme than, say, if you have a little thumbnail at the bottom that explains like a caption of what's going on, right? So there's a convention to doing memes where you capture the picture all in one and you put the words over the text. And that's because in that context, it's best for the audience. It's easier for them to see the picture all at once because in that situation, that's how it goes. But it's not how we come to the idea as meme creators or whatever. The same is true with academic writing, that there's a reason historically, going back to early academic writing, that we've decided that the thesis, its best placement is at the end of the introduction And it comes back a lot to what you said, Ariana, about we've introduced the topic for our readers. So I want us to practice a little bit of what I call like academic empathy. Why is it that we want the thesis at the front of our paper when in our writing process, we might not discover the thesis or really figure out the ins and outs of the thesis until the end of our writing process? So do you see the difference there, that it goes at the front of the product, but often the thesis happens for us as writers at the end of the process? So why would we move it up front if we figure it out at the end? Why would our readers need that? Any guesses on that?
To help them have a more understanding about what we're writing about.
Sure. Yeah. 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 And why would they need that early though? Why not wait until the end? I'm playing devil's advocate here. So if it's frustrating for me to push like this, then that's good, because that's what I'm going for.
Yes, so to find out whether they want to continue to read the
That's
paper.
that's absolutely one of the primary reasons we need the thesis up front. And so that's really important. Ariana, you're also getting at a separate piece that's important, but I want to dive deep into what Rachel just said, because that's number one primary, that you put your thesis at the front of the paper because you're writing to people who are busy. You all are busy. Do you want to read a 20-page paper if you don't have to? And furthermore, isn't it great that you can give the reader the argument up front so that they know that you're dealing with the topic they need to deal with? Let me give you a good example of this. There's a book, I actually should be able to pull it up here for you, and I can make it sort of real for you all. So let me find the book here. There's this guy. Promise I've got this one in my brain here. Oh, I know, I'm typing in the title wrong. So let me share this with you all. So you all know that here, if you all know anything about me, you know that I study stand-up comedy, that's one of my research areas. And I study stand-up comedy. And this is a book that's called Stand-up Comedy in Theory, or Abjection in America. So this is the title of the book. You can tell it's not a beautiful book by any stretch of the imagination. But what's really interesting about this book is that even though it's on stand-up comedy, it's not a book that I would read, because the topic of it is a different approach to stand-up than I take. Meaning, I study what the comedians say, and I study how it's received, or the comedian's popularity. This is a book that studies sort of the psychoanalysis of stand-up comedy culturally. I know that may not make a ton of sense to you all, because I'm still talking about a field that's outside of the realm of what you're working with. But what I mean here is, we both look at the same thing, but we look at it from such different angles that I don't want to read that book. It doesn't, and it's not just that I don't want to read it, but it's not beneficial because it's in the same area as what I'm doing, but it's so different in the approach that it doesn't fit my research. And it's great that they tell me up front what the approach is they're going to take. So it's not just the topic. The topic is something I would want, but they tell me the approach they're going to take. And that allows me to know that I don't need to read it, that it's outside of the purview of what I'm studying. So part of it really and truly is just to save readers time. Let them know right up front if they need to read this or if they don't need to read this, and they get to decide that. The other reason that we put the argument up front, I want us to think back to the idea of an attorney. So we go through the evidence much like an attorney would, but then when an attorney gets to court, she'll present that evidence and that argument, the whole argument, in her opening statement. And the reason is that the jury needs to know what the attorney is arguing, because the jury wants the attorney to be right. They don't want to have their time wasted with a wrong argument, but they're not going to accept that the attorney's process of that the attorney's argument or interpretation of the evidence is accurate until they know what they're trying to say and then know how they're going to go about showing this. So if you think about it in that respect, think about these sort of court trials that last years, right? So the OJ trial, I think I mentioned the last time, took a year and a half. But if it wasn't until the last day that they said what they think happened, then that jury would have to go back all the way to the beginning and think about all the evidence to make sure it actually still works. And so it's all about artificial presentation, or not artificial, it's about presenting the information to the reader in the order they need it. So ultimately comes back to the audience. And that's what makes it very different than, say, a fiction or say a screenplay where you have a twist ending at the end. Twist ending is good because it works with what the audience wants. They want to be entertained, they want to be surprised, they want to be shocked. This is not a space to surprise or shock or any of that. You want to let them know right up front what you're doing in your argument so that they can check what you're saying against the evidence as you present it. Now, the audience is really important here. So we talked a little bit last week about audience. Tell me a little bit about who your audience would be if you were writing a paper, say in your major. So we've got Rachel, you're thinking about working, say, in criminal justice, or at least in criminal justice reform, right? And so if you think about that, who might be an audience for a paper you write in a criminal justice class a couple of years from now? Who would you picture to be the audience of a paper, say, on prison reform in Georgia?
Then probably my audience is going to be maybe the wardens of the prison, maybe the other attorneys who are working with me for the prison reform, to explain to them what I want done and how I think it should be done.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, it's certainly possible. It's also equally possible, or more likely, arguably, that it would go to other people who are studying the prison reform. So specifically studying, think about the people who are studying whether or not certain policies or changes actually work, right? That would be even more important, because often the warden and the people who are in charge of the prisons are kind of order takers in a respect, where they have to operate within the boundaries of what they've been charged to do. But those boundaries are set and based off of research that was done by research completed by scholars in your field. What's great about this is that you can now start thinking through who those people are. And the easiest route to go for, the easiest route for most of us is to think about professors who would study in that field, because it's what we do for a living, right? What's interesting here, kind of to your point, Rachel, I study stand-up comics, but no stand-up comic will ever read my work, right? And so even though they're directly affected or I'm studying them, they're not going to read it because they're not interested in studying it, they're performing it. So it's crazy how close it is. It's really, their lives are impacted. A great, probably the best corollary I have is that most elementary school teachers read 0 articles on elementary school scholarship after they graduate, right? So they'll get the job and then they start practicing it, but they're not researching or studying necessarily. That's not a slight on them. That's just the reality, is that often they're so busy just doing the work of teaching that they're not studying the sort of current scholarship, and certainly not engaging in it as frequently as somebody who, say, is teaching at Mercer and training the new teachers of the future. And kind of to your point about the warden, that's kind of the way that this information or this research reshapes the world. So it's a slow process, right? And so you'd think about, say, if there's a warden here at Mercer in criminal justice, but not a warden today, but somebody who's studying and eventually will end up a warden, this is the process by which they learn new information. It's crazy how slow it is, but really interesting as well. What's also important here, let's talk for just a moment about how audience shapes what you do and don't put into your paper. The way I want you to think about an audience is a little more complicated than what we've likely been told in the past. A lot of times, many of you have been told something akin to, imagine your readers don't know anything about the topic. We've probably heard that a lot. And if we think about our audience in the way I just described, that's probably not the best approach, right? That if we're writing to professors studying in the field and we assume they know nothing, we're probably going to over-explain quite a bit. So a better way to think about it is that your audience is like somebody who went to the same movie as you, but went to a different showing. So your job is just to zoom in on the details that they need to know about the evidence, not necessarily explain all the background and information like that. But again, kind of keeping with that idea of your audience is busy and they don't have a lot of time for you to mess around, kind of trying to hook them in or over explain these details. It also takes a lot of that pressure off of us because we can zoom in on the information and then really go for a deep dive into those topics from there. Now, let's go back over here, and I want us to talk a little bit now about the idea of argument. So argument in the academic setting is a different term than what we've probably heard in our lives in the past. If we think about argument, some of the terms that I don't love are when we tell students to choose a side. That's not very helpful information for prepping you for the type of work that we're going to do in the future. At least I don't believe so. And so don't tell my other co-teachers this. If you get taught in 175 to take a side, just take a side. But know that this is probably a little better approach for you and probably going to help you out, hopefully a little more. An argument in the academic setting, let me type it here so you all can remember it. So in the academic setting, an argument is a supported interpretation of the evidence. And that's what it is here. What's different about an argument is that it's not a fight. And what I mean by that is everybody's on the same team. So think for a minute about, say, a women and gender studies program at Mercer, for example. So if we have a women and gender studies program, I know we do at COPA. So we've got the women and gender studies program here at COPA where you can, or concentration, not program, sorry. So you can take these courses from different faculty members who are studying women and gender studies, but there's not a pro-sexism team and an anti-sexism team. There aren't faculty members who are trying to figure out how to make sexism more pervasive and patriarchy stronger. There are only faculty members who are trying to understand all the ways that sexism and patriarchy, heteronormativity, etc., interact to create power dynamics. So they're all on the same team. So an academic argument is very different than an argument we might have elsewhere. And it's not about choosing a side. It's actually about looking at the same topic from different perspectives and trying to help the reader understand that topic on a deeper level. So for you all, as you're moving ahead, keep in mind that your job is really to just examine something from an angle that's not been examined before. So be thinking of that as you move forward throughout your time here at Mercer, but know that we're all kind of on the same team trying to understand everything on a deeper level. So the best approach that you can take here is to think of, instead of starting with a thesis, to build a great argument, instead of starting with a thesis, begin with a great question. What I mean by that is a great question might be something, if you were in history, for example, if you started with a question like how do we understand gender and labor within so if we started with this question, so instead of starting with a thesis, so a thesis might be something like, if we started with a thesis or a draft of a thesis, why is it doing that for me here? Oh, I know what's going on. Can I fix this, everybody? Here we go. So if we were in a history class, for example, we might start with a thesis. So the best, if we were thinking about history and we wanted to write a paper on gender in the Civil War, we might say something like, there was a lot of sexism during the Civil War. That might be our thesis draft. We'll call it a thesis rough draft. And so that's if we look at this as a rough draft of a thesis, say we decided, you know what, we're not going to start with a question, we're just going to start with a thesis. That's not a great thesis, right? Because it's pretty obvious. There's nobody who would look back at any period of time and believe that there's not a lot of sexism, right? Everybody knows this, so it's not really helpful. And the goal of a great paper is to add to the reader's understanding. In this context, our reader would be a history professor. So a history professor wouldn't look at this and think, oh, I'm about to learn something new. However, if we asked a question like this at the start of our process, how do we understand gender and labor during the Civil War? So we ask a great question. Then if we set out to answer that, and at the end of it, we come up with a thesis based on this, where our answer So the answer to a great question becomes our great thesis, becomes a great thesis. So here our thesis would be something like, instead, our thesis now is the answer to the question. And that right there is going to be a great question, great thesis. Now, we don't know what this is, obviously. What's nice about this is that our sample thesis is not one that we could possibly come up with within an hour. That if we think about finishing this sentence up, sort of Mad Lib style, it would require quite a bit of work. We would have to really go to the books and try to understand how these two things interact, gender and labor. And that can be intimidating for folks, but it's doable. And it's really helpful to know that if you can just answer a great question, that answer becomes your great thesis. And it seems, it may not seem obvious, but it seems obvious from this side of the desk. The reason it works is that, again, the goal of a great paper is to add to the reader's understanding. And the best way to go about doing that is by asking a question that they would love to have the answer to, and then doing the work of finding the answer for them so they don't have to go to the books and do that work themselves. And so that's why it's really important to start with that question and really think about what it is you hope to answer for them. Now let's talk about here the idea of complicating our thesis. So I want to zoom in on this point right here, a little bullet point. I know I'm kind of all over the map, but I kind of dig it, right? I think we talked a little bit about the thesis, or maybe this will be a part of that discussion. Now, when we're thinking about complicating our thesis, let's think about this for a minute. Our thesis, when we're talking about a thesis, we've often been told that our goal in a paper is to prove our thesis. Does that sound accurate for the experience you've had, Ariana or Rachel? Now, imagine, let's go through a thought exercise for a moment or two. Imagine I gave you a paper assignment that is like graduate level. So graduate level papers are routinely, the requirement can be 20 to 25 pages for a paper. And you come up with a thesis, something like there's a lot of sexism during the Civil War. And then you decide you're going to prove that. How do you think that paper goes for you? To imagine what that experience is like. What are the roadblocks you're going to run into? I see Rachel's already shaking her head. Doesn't want to do that assignment, and I don't either. Nobody does.
I would think you don't have enough to build off of to begin with.
Okay.
Like you need to have something very specific that you can dig into, that you can then expand upon and grow from. It's almost like there's not a good starting point. I don't know that that's.
Yeah, there's not a good starting point, especially because the topic is pretty obvious. And then also imagine that you sit down and you say you get 4 or 5 pages in, and you've done a great job of showing few examples of sexism during the Civil War. Then what do you do? What do you do when you're 5 pages in and every paragraph says something like, another reason I'm right is this, and another reason I'm right is this, and another reason I'm right is this? Then you run out of steam pretty quickly. And that's a tricky place to be, because you will get assigned bigger papers in your lifetime. So what we do instead is we ask a good question, and then we start thinking of smaller, complicating questions. So for example, if we think about our job as asking all the smaller questions. So let's say, for example, we're going to go with this question that we started with up here. So we've got this question here. How do we understand gender and labor during the Civil War? So that's our question. So we'll call it our central question. Now, instead of starting the paper, let's build up some complicating questions. And what complicating questions are questions that will help us understand the ways that the answer to this question here is complicated. And so think about it a little bit like this, right? Everybody in this space chose to go to Mercer, but that decision to come to Mercer isn't as simple as just tuition dollars, right? You didn't just choose Mercer because it's the least expensive, because it's not the least expensive, right? Especially for this level, you could have easily gone to a community college for less money. So it wasn't about money, although that's a factor to be sure, right? But there are other variables that weigh in. So what were the questions you asked about schools before settling in on Mercer? What were some of the things you needed to research first before choosing this as your ideal school?
One of the big ones for me was, did they offer the major that I was interested in?
Great. What majors are offered, right? So we've got tuition and majors. What else did you think about?
I thought about how the classes would schedule. Like, I like that Mercer's are 8 weeks at a time.
Great. What about the schedule? And also not just the schedule, but also what about the timing of it, right? So it could have been 3 weeks, but we met every night. That wouldn't have worked, right? But it could have been 8 weeks where you meet one time a week or asynchronous. So you're looking at that. But then also, if we think about this idea of complicating questions, it's also probably not enough just to know that they teach online. You might want to ask questions about, what about the learning platform? What about the course load? What about the instructors? Have they been trained in this? How do we make sure that we're making steady progress? What do I do? So there are all these questions that start digging deeper into it, to where if it were just about dollars and cents, that wouldn't require study and interrogation. But the truth is, we have to complicate that narrative, where we're looking more at all these different factors, and even the major question. So if you think about the major, we offer, lots of schools in Atlanta offer your major, but then the questions become things like, what about specializations? What about the courses? What about field work? What about internships? We've got lots of other ways that we can examine that. And then we have to weigh them. And that's where that argument and analysis comes in, because we have to figure out exactly where each thing fits, because it's a little bit like, it's a little bit like thinking about buying a car. If it were just about dollars and cents, everybody would buy a Kia, right? They're the least expensive, but it's not just about that. And if it were just about style, then everybody would be buying a Lexus, right? And if it were just about comfort, everybody would buy a Cadillac. But it's not just that there are a lot of different reasons that people still spend a lot more money on certain vehicles than others. And everybody has different needs, but the interpretation is what matters, because you have to line up your needs with what's available and then decide within those sort of boundaries. But that requires no small amount of analysis. The same holds true when we're thinking about these questions, right? So when we're thinking about a question about labor and gender during the Civil War, we would have to ask some complicating questions. For example, we might have to ask something like, how were jobs broken up according to sex, right? So that'd be one. So how was money, how did work differ regionally by gender? So thinking through, was the North different than the South? And especially you had the agricultural South and the industrial North. You'd have to ask this, right? So then you would also have to ask, how did age affect the division of labor by gender, right? So you think about, were little girls doing the same work that old women were? Were little boys doing the same work that, say, older women were, right? So how do we look at that to really understand it? And if we think about this, these are just 3 questions, but we're already moving in that direction where we're looking for more complications, to where we can understand our topic or the answer to our question more deeply. Instead of just proving we're right, we're going to ultimately end up with a thesis, because the answer to the question is our thesis, right? But we're also going to be able to explore the topic for depth instead of just proving we're right. Of course, we're going to end up proving we're right about our answer, because we're going to ground our information in evidence. But you also want to think through, what kinds of questions would your reader need to see? I'll type a couple more just so we can kind of get a sense of this one here. And you could pretty easily see these questions developing to ask questions about the difference between the North and the South. You could also ask questions about class. How did rich people experience the division of labor differently than poor people? You could, in the Civil War, you could certainly ask questions about the division of labor among, at the early part of the war, enslaved people versus people after free people, and then also thinking through the labor of people who were still living in the South in African Americans living in the South in rougher conditions, you could ask those questions. But you see how if we ask enough questions, then suddenly we have topics for each paragraph to address. The other piece of this is if we think about our thesis here being the answer to this question, what's nice is that the answer to each of these questions is a claim to open our paragraphs. So it's our topic sentence. So if you think about the answer there, jobs were broken up according to sex in this way. And then you'd need to show evidence. If you think of the reading said topic sentence, evidence, and then discussion. So then you would offer that evidence to show where it is, and then you discuss the evidence from there. And then you move on to the next question. And pretty soon we're now in a situation where our paper is getting better and it's getting longer because we're filling it in with all these complicating points. The last thing that I'll say here is that if you are still not sure how you feel about what I'm describing here in terms of complicating your thesis, if you still feel really comfortable with the idea that your job in a paper is to prove your thesis, then what I'm going to offer to you here is the Facebook thesis. This is the thesis for people who want to go into a topic knowing they have an argument to make, but wanting to take that next step to make their paper much better. Instead of just listing a lot of reasons they're right, they want to find ways to dig deeper. So your thesis for the rough draft, let me type it here so people can see this. Use the Facebook thesis for your rough draft. I want to make sure that it's clear that this is just for the rough draft, because don't leave this in your paper in the long run. But if you want to prove your thesis, use this thesis. It's complicated. So that's it. So if you think back, let me see if I can kind of move this all onto the same page. Let me go back over here. I'd like us to see it all at the same time. So if we think of our central question as this, how do we understand gender and labor during the Civil War? So you ask that question and then use this thesis. Just say it's complicated. And then tell us all the ways it's complicated. So each paragraph, instead of saying another reason I'm right, say another reason it's complicated is because of region. Another reason it's complicated is because of age. Another reason it's complicated is because the war shifted and so did labor roles. Another reason it's complicated is because it was different before the war as opposed to after it. So using it's complicated will help you to dig for depth and fill out that paper. And if you use this sort of model, what's really great, what makes me most excited, is that you won't ever really have to worry about page length anymore, because your job will just be to ask the next logical question and move your way through. So if you ever get stuck, instead of thinking, what am I going to write about? Ask, what would somebody want to know next? Or what would they need me to address later on in this process? And it can help you get there much more efficiently. Now we have just a little bit of time. I want to revisit this one here, this topic, so that I make sure that we've covered it. So the thesis affects what we do and don't include in our paper, effectively because it's our focus area. So the thesis is going to tell us what's within and without the purview of our topic. And so the thesis, or even the central question, is a good kind of boundary marker. Think of them as your gutter busters when you go to the bowling alley with a little kid, those big inflatable tubes they put in the gutters. That's kind of your thesis. It will give you the parameters of what you can and can't study. I know that it's probably not something you're going to run into just yet, because a lot of times when we're in 100, 200 level courses, we're so concerned with reaching page length that we're not worried about what we're going to cut. But I want to treat you all in the advanced way that your work reflects that you are very soon going to be pushing up against way too much, and you're going to need to cut things from your paper. And that's really the ideal situation, because the more you can cut, the better your paper is going to be. It's kind of like, well, you get the idea. I'm not going to give you an analogy. I'll go analogy crazy here. So let me rein it in for a second. But the thesis is helpful because it can set the parameters. Let me show you a quick example of kind of one of the projects that I did years ago. It's one of my favorite things, but I'll give you an example of kind of what I'm talking about with setting those parameters for your work. So there's this book that I worked on years ago. I didn't write it, so it's not a humble brag, I promise. But I was tied to the project, so I guess that's kind of a humble brag. So this woman here, you'll see her name is Laura White Brunner, and she was the second woman ever to climb Half Dome You see my name there. It's on Amazon. So this is like the nerd equivalent of having like the blue check mark on Twitter. And this woman here climbed Half Dome. So if you don't know Half Dome, the North Face logo is a reference to this rock formation in Yosemite called Half Dome. That literally is just a big rock that's half a dome. It's beautiful. If you've not been, you need to go tomorrow, drop out of school, hop on the road, go see Yosemite, and then re-enroll and finish up and everything. But for right now, you get the idea of how important it is. So when I was doing this research to put together the introduction for this book, I found a lot of other interesting people. So she was fascinating in her own right. You could see she's climbing up the side of this rock wall. She's wearing a dress and she's not allowed to wear pants because this was 1915. So she had to hike in pants. And she also had to hike barefoot often because they didn't make hiking boots for women in 1915. So she was crazy, not in a good way. I mean, she was intense. I think she's incredible. Also appropriate, she's buried in Arlington National Cemetery. So on Veterans Day, I think it's kind of a cool fact that she was a plotter during World War II. So she's served our country in some interesting ways as well. Fascinating person. But during the process of doing this work, I set out to answer the question. My central question was, who is this and why does she matter? That's my question. And my answer is it's complicated. It's complicated by the fact that she was so young and when she lived and when she wrote and what she did. And it was complicated by the history of the national park and technology. So the access to the park was really difficult. So I had to look at all these things to figure out, why does she even matter? Because if it's just some, this is going to sound awful, but if it's just some white woman on vacation, who cares, right? But if it's somebody who did something remarkable, why was it remarkable? Why does it matter that a 15-year-old climbed this peak? Why does it matter that she wrote a book in the 40s and it didn't get published? So I had to look at all that. So in the process of researching, though, I found lots of other fascinating people. There was a woman who paddled through the Everglades in a straw. She was a nun who traveled through the Everglades in a straw canoe. And then when she was done with that, she went to the Yukon Territory. And that was in like the 1870s, right? She went by herself. And that's a fascinating person. But remember, my thesis and my question set some guardrails and said she's fascinating and interesting, but she doesn't belong here in this book. So it made it easier for me not to end up in a rabbit hole chasing sort of a research project that wasn't the same thing that I set out to do. For you all, my hope is that you'll start feeling, I'm seeing this in the reflections too, as you start feeling more confident that it doesn't matter how long the paper assignment is, you feel confident you can tackle it because you're building those skills, like learning to ask questions to know how to push your paper in the right direction. Because you're learning those skills, you're going to pretty soon feel confident that you can finish a paper assignment no matter what the length. And that's going to also lead to some new challenges, because what you're going to have to do is figure out how to stay within boundaries so that you don't end up with a 30-page paper when the assignment says 12. And that's a good place to be, but it also means it's a new skill we're going to have to learn, and using the thesis as those boundaries is important. Last thing we want to cover, let's talk a little bit about APA style. MLA style is what they use in the languages. So let me go back here and just kind of type this for the visual folks. I know a few people mentioned that they were, they like to see things kind of written out. So I want to be respectful of that. So APA stands for the American Psychological Association. And then MLA is the Modern Language Association. And then Chicago style is just named after all the presses that are in Chicago, right? So the old school sort of publishing houses back in the day, that's where they were all housed, so they had their own style. At COPA, we use APA. The reason we use APA is because we only have graduate programs in counseling and in criminal justice, which would use psychology. I guess we have some in computer science, but the lion's share of the people who need to know how to cite are going to be working with psychology. So we use APA. MLA is used, as you can imagine, by languages. So any classes that you take where the title of the course is language spoken today, that's going to use MLA. So English, Spanish, French, Italian, those courses use MLA. And then Chicago style is used, as I mentioned, typically just for publishing. So most of us at this tier won't be, or at this level of our level, I'm trying not to say it hierarchically. at this point in our journey, will not need to know Chicago. Now, the reason that these formats exist is that the formats help people to keep everything consistent and to show the things that matter to the different fields. So let me go over to Purdue OWL. You all probably know Purdue OWL. If you don't already, let's kind of take a peek at this one. Purdue, just as a note, just so that you can understand why Purdue is so important in this area, they were the first school in America to study how to best teach writing. So they would do quantitative studies. So a good example would be they would give 20 students a certain lesson on APA style and 20 students a different lesson. And then they would literally count the number of people who did it right versus the people who didn't to see which way was more effective. And so they would literally do these quantitative studies. They would do a bunch of others as well, but Purdue was the first school. So they're the Harvard of what we call rhetoric and composition studies, what I do for a living. Now, when we go to the APA guide here, we're going to get a lot of really useful videos. I think it looks like maybe they took the pop-ups off. That's great news. There used to be these pop-up ads that were really just a nightmare. And here we're going to get a general format. Was that a pop-up there? Well, can you tell that I've got a little one in the house? It brought up the Pampers. Yeah, it must be hearing me talk to my wife here. It's probably going to be some Florida State thing or something embarrassing here. Great. So when we look at the format, what we get are, we're going to get a lot of different details that will show us what matters in the APA. And notice, for example, here we have a sample title page. And this is pretty straightforward, that they want to know what page you're starting on. They need to know the title of your work. And also just thinking through the course name and number in the school, that's really so we can keep this organized, because if you're a professor, chances are good you might be frazzled pretty often, as you can probably pick up on from old Doc Champ here. But also, if I go to the dining hall at Purdue and I put down a stack of papers and accidentally leave, that's so I can get it back. And the page numbers, so if I drop them on the sidewalk, I can put them back in order, or I can go look for the pages where I know there's something I need to work on. And then the date, of course, is helpful for us to know things like which draft it is. So if you're a graduate student of mine, I might get 20 drafts of yours saved in my computer, and I want to make sure that I'm not revising or offering you feedback on something you've already submitted a newer version of, right? So there's a purpose for each of these. It can feel like hazing, it can feel frustrating at times, but really spending a little bit of time to make sure you're doing this right is really important. The other reason it's really important is that if you do a good job on each of these steps, your professors will 100% believe you to be the smartest person that's ever stepped into their classroom. And it's all very manageable stuff. It's kind of like following a recipe really carefully if you like cooking like I like cooking. We'll talk a little more about APA. Let me give you one tip for everybody, or sort of a personal challenge if you're interested in getting better at APA, which I hope you all are, because it will serve you so well. It's not fun. It's not exciting. It's the equivalent of eating kale, but that's exactly the point here. That the most successful students are the ones who do the things that are not as fun and exciting, because then you're going to be in a position to really focus your professor's energies on helping you take that next step. So if you're doing these things well, then that means your professor doesn't have to comment on APA. He or she can instead help you work and push your writing and thinking to the next level. So what I would recommend everybody do is come here to Purdue OWL, click on the APA link, and then if you remember this first page, we have all of these little tabs and everything. And just take a moment and go through a few of the tabs and read over things. They're not terribly long, but they are going to help you so much. They will absolutely help you. Let me show you the best example of this helping someone. So if we go here to reference list, audio visual media, I talk to students all the time in my 175 and 180 course, and they'll send me an email and they'll say, hey, Dr. Champion, how do I do an APA reference entry for a YouTube video? And I know then that they haven't checked, because there it is. So in a sense, just coming to this and scanning over and knowing, being a little bit familiar, will save you all that time and headache of sending your professor an email to ask a question you could answer on your own. And it will really, really make you feel much more confident that whatever types of sources you're hoping to bring into your paper, or however you need to bring them in, you will be skilled and set up to do so. So it's another analogy, last one for the day. It's like if you went to Home Depot and you bought a really great toolkit and you went home and you just look through it. You don't have to use them at all. You just want to know what's there. And especially know what's there, not just for the, you know, there are going to be screwdrivers and wrenches and hammers. You already know that. But what are the tools you have that may be less commonly used, but knowing they're there will save you a trip to Home Depot when you're stressed out? Because you're middle of a project and you now need a tool that you didn't realize you needed. And then you think to yourself, oh, wait, I think there's one in the bottom of the toolbox in the back. And then you know that it's there. That's kind of what we're dealing with here. So that kind of covers everything. I know that it's a lot of information coming at you quickly. Just in sum, remember to ask a good question instead of a thesis right up front for the rough draft. For the final draft, you need the answer. So don't leave that question in your paper, but use it as a tool to get to a better thesis. Same thing with the complicating questions. Generate a list of questions you could ask that would require analysis of the evidence. And if you do that, then each one of them can be converted into its own paragraph very successfully to move you deeper into the topic rather than just proving you're right. And then lastly, take a look over APA and begin becoming familiar with it. The sooner you do this, the better off you are. Again, it's like eating kale. I'm not telling you it's going to be exciting. You're not going to do that tonight on Friday night with your family, sit them down for game night and be like, all right, we're going to cite a bunch of stuff. Instead, what you do is you start working on it slowly and you kind of get familiar with it. Take next time you're on the bus for 20 minutes, just scroll through Purdue Owl, take a peek, or you're waiting in a doctor's office or whatever it is you're doing with your life. Do you have any questions for the good of the order here? All right, well, thank you too for joining us. If you're joining us from Edpuzzle, I hope you're doing well. Don't hesitate to reach out. I saw a couple of people mention in reflections that they had questions and they decided not to send over those emails. Send over those emails. And if you don't get a response, send another one, pester me. I'm here to help. That's what I'm here to do. And I'm happy to do so. Hope you're all doing well wherever you are. I will stick around for you too if you have questions, but otherwise I'm gonna stop the recording here. Thanks, everybody.